I'm not sure when my speaking part is starting now. Thank you very much for being here. This is the panel on the future of work, which is a very topical theme for all of us professionally, but also personally. I'm very pleased to introduce my co-panelists, and I have to go to my crib notes to do that. So first of all, Brian Mullins, who is the CEO of Foundry. You're looking at how technology impacts the future of work, so very keen to hear more on that. Then we have Matt Warman, Conservative MP for Boston and Skegness, and you've recently been charged to lead an initiative to review the future of work, so it'll be interesting to hear more on that. And you're working with Dora on that, who's working for the aptly named Institute for the Future of Work, and you're focusing on strategic programs there, so it would be good to hear more on that. And then last, certainly not least, Stuart, who has a background in real estate and looks at how clustering impacts the future of work. So very, very broad range of topics, and we'd really love to make this panel as agile as possible, and also invite you to ask questions, to have the panelists share their views on that. So please think about that while we're kicking things off. And as you are nearest to me, Brian, perhaps tell us a bit more about what Foundry does and how you are looking at the future of work.
Thank you, and it's great to be here this morning. I'm Brian Mullins, the CEO of Foundry. We are an Oxford University spin-out, and we focus on high-stakes applications of artificial intelligence. So that's where decisions are made that affects people's lives, or when those decisions are made at the scale of populations. Our customers work across sectors like insurance, as well as government and security and defense, where the stakes get very high. And you know, our founders, we were founded by Professor Steve Roberts and Professor Mike Osborne, who are professors of machine learning at the university, and they've both done extensive work about the impact of artificial intelligence when it comes to automation and specifically the future of work. And we're very interested in how these effects shape both the human condition for individuals as well as all the way up to the macro and economic effects that will be caused by these transitions.
Thank you. And then Matt, I'm reading here, the review into the future of work commissioned by the government. What's at the back of the mind of the government?
Where to start? There have been many and various government reviews in this country and around the world into the future of work. Obviously, the pandemic has moved a lot of things in ways that perhaps were already happening but have been accelerated. Brexit is also a factor. There's a whole host of things that play into this. And the work that I've been asked to do divides it into 4 pillars, although they do very much interact if pillars can interact. And those are workers' rights, AI and automation, skills, and what we're sort of generically calling place, which covers everything from how do you balance the sort of juggle of looking after children, increasingly looking after older relatives as well, but also commuting, to what extent does hybrid working change that, and also to some extent what's going on the high street. How does the future of work look in terms of how it changes the urban environment in particular? And obviously all of those things interact, but I think what strikes me in some ways is that this very often, particularly in environments such as this, it focuses on flexible working and remote working and all that. And I think what we do have to bear in mind is, for all of the importance of that, there are going to continue to be huge chunks of the workforce that will simply not be able to benefit from those sorts of changes because of the nature of the important work that they do. And how do we make sure that the benefits of the changing world of work are spread as evenly across the workforce as they possibly can be, and how do we try and avoid some of the unintended consequences that might happen if we don't?
Thank you, and that's actually an interesting jump-off point perhaps for you, Dora, because I think you are looking at the Institute of the Future of Work also at how, where you are based in the country, how might that access impact the access you have to work. So perhaps your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barbara. Yes, so I work for the Institute for the Future of Work, which is an independent research and development institute here, but we work across the UK. I'm the head of programmes, which means I oversee the different programmes of the institute, and we're also the strategic research partner of the APPG for the Future of Work, which brings together parliamentarians, industry, and civil society to talk about some of these key issues. I think that's absolutely right, Barbara. Place is a big issue here. As Matt said, you know, where you are, the region you're in, can often have a huge impact on the way you experience some of these changes. And that's why one of the big programs that we've got at the moment is called the Pissarides Review into the Future of Work and Wellbeing. And that's looking at disruption across the UK and really at a granular level, trying to understand how each region of the UK is likely to be disrupted by some of these new technologies, and also the kind of decisions that employers make when introducing these technologies. Because there are parts of the UK where technology is being adopted at a much faster rate than other parts. And yet, at the moment, there isn't a lot of evidence to show us why that is, what impacts those decisions regarding adoption. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at in this review. I'm sure we'll get into some of the other things, but just to say, we're also doing a lot of work on the changing nature of work. So I think, as you were commenting, things like the gig economy and how work might be changing, how AI might be changing our experiences of work. And we've got a lot of different programs looking at that as well, and how that might change over the coming years.
And then sort of following with the theme of places, which is also, of course, very relevant to you, Stuart, perhaps tell us more about your cluster approach, and then how that creates places of opportunity.
Good. Well, nice to be here. So nice to see everybody. We're in the business of creating clusters that promote innovation. So we set up our business about 2 years ago, backed by Brookfield, a big Canadian investor, and we've built up a series of clusters in the UK initially, and we have aspirations to have more clusters in Europe and in other parts of the UK over time. And it's called Advanced Research Clusters. So we shorten it to ARC, which is easier to remember. And and we've now, the scale of the business is quite big. It's about £2 billion worth in terms of value. We have over 350 organizations within our clusters. Probably about 7,000 people working there in our different clusters. The ones that stand out are Harwell. You might know of Harwell. It's about 20 minutes south of Oxford. It's 700 acres. And that's kind of our flagship cluster. It's the first one we acquired in joint venture with Science, Technology and Facilities Council and UK Atomic Energy Authority. So Brookfield have 50% of that. And I'm the CEO of the business. But it's a really, if you kind of dream about what the ideal cluster looks like, if you were to kind of design it on a blank piece of paper, I'm slightly biased, but I'd say it's at Harwell. You've got green fields, you've got mature trees, you've got cool coffee shops, places to eat, yoga events. There's the biggest runner event in Europe. But more importantly, in our buildings, we focus on the space industry. We've got 100 space companies, we've got 80 life science companies, we've got 80 energy tech companies, we've got a new cluster focused on quantum computing. So that's what we do. We kind of create these physical environments, these ecosystems that help innovators, scientists, technologists thrive. So.
And then perhaps, as we are at a technology-oriented conference, how do you see these physical clusters being disrupted by technology?
Physical, I think we promote disruption. So innovation comes through disruption, and if you were to imagine how do you innovate, how do you disrupt, how do you move forward? If you were to try and do that sitting on an island in the middle of the Atlantic by yourself, quite tricky. But if you're juxtaposed to 6,000 other technologists, scientists, innovators, I was there yesterday. I went down to the coffee shop, and there's people, a company called Astroscale, Japanese company. They're cool. They're they clean debris from space. So they're in the space sector, but next to the table next to them were people from one of our new tenants called Vaxitech, who are in the vaccine manufacturing business. So I think technology is obviously disrupting all the time, and I think Harwell celebrates disruption, collisions, collaboration, etc. So I think we promote multidisciplinary environments. So it's quite interesting. These clusters, the space people, they do good business and interesting research. If they're talking to people in the life science sector, same in the energy tech, people might deal with the people in space, etc., and quantum computing. So I think having an ecosystem that promotes disruption and cross collaboration across multidisciplines, scientific disciplines, is really important.
And as perhaps the most technology-focused panelist here, you're really working at the intersection of putting that disruption through technology into action by having, the human workforce operate with the increasingly automated workforce. How will that impact, our personal work experience potentially going forward? And are there sectors that are particularly impacted by that?
This is the big question. There are sectors that will be particularly impacted, but I think it's also safe to say all sectors are going to be impacted. What we see, though, is not necessarily always a very negative trend, and I think it comes back to some key factors about what automation can do, what it can't do, and more what we're seeing, machine learning and artificial intelligence, and what it's allowing for new types of automation that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. I think all of these things are coming together and reshaping even how we're thinking about the future of work. This is very, very complex and recursive set of questions. But the encouraging bits are that there's these tentpole ideas that not all of jobs are automated away. Some of the job is automated away. And so we should be really thinking about changing the shape of the work that an individual does as much as the change at the macro levels. This is important because then we can think about changing the shape of roles so that the people are doing more of what they're doing and what they do well, and the automation is doing what it does well. I think in particular in what we do with high stakes applications, it also makes it much more tangible for AI to make an impact when it's delicate to do so. Let me give it a very tangible example of that. Working in domains like policing, where you can't afford for bias to shape an outcome in a way that isn't the same if you get it wrong in another industry, it's even more impactful and can be tragic, and we've seen it worldwide. And police forces that are trying to use the technology most responsibly, they understand that it's not a magic artificially intelligent police officer. It's much better automating things in the back office so the police officers can do what they do best. And I think if you consider that, then you can approach the fact that the back office tasks also have a tremendous amount of risk associated with them. If I were just to read a form and misidentify someone as a suspect instead of a victim, that could have tragic consequences. And so we still have the burden of the responsibility, but it's going to unlock the ability for the humans to do what they do well and really actually have an impact. And so I think it's hopeful as much as it is this kind of ominous transition that we're facing down.
Very interesting. And then perhaps, Dora, for you a question, because you're also thinking strategically about how we need to adapt as a workforce and what sort of skills we need to build. Now, having heard that, it might be a division of labor between, AI, machines, and then the human. Are you working on any initiatives to to look at what would that mean for the workforce and the skill development?
Yeah, I think two things I'd mention there. The first thing, as you said, is what skills programs should be accompanying programs which might be encouraging tech adoption. So, if you're going to be trying to encourage work to have or to be adopting more technology, companies to be thinking about how they maintain at the cutting edge, then that goes hand in hand with thinking about what are the retraining programs, how are the ways that you can support this transition for your workforce. The second thing I think is really important is how workers are, how technology is introduced in the workforce or in the workplace. So there we've done a lot of work looking at how employers can work in collaboration with their workforce so that this isn't something that is feared by the, a bit of how we take away the uncertainty of new technologies and create a dialogue amongst the whole workplace, which we actually find can mean that technology is better implemented. It's shaped by people that know the job and can lead to better outcomes. So I think they would be the two things that I think are important to think about.
Thank you. And then, perhaps, Matt, for you, with a government's lens on, opportunities and challenges in an economy that's more and more driven by technology, less driven by people, perhaps. What would you say are the key opportunities, but also the key challenges?
Yeah, and it's an important distinction, I think, to say a lot of this is inevitably for business. It is right that business is left to get on with working out for itself how it can be as productive as it possibly can. But at the same time, it is clearly in government's interest to address the productivity challenges. It is clearly in government's interest to make sure that those to sort of some of your points, that some of the potential discrimination that arises from the inappropriate use of technology, where we have plenty of sort of norms and legislation and all that covers this stuff, that we don't accidentally say, well, this is a sort of completely novel problem, when actually we've already got literal laws that cover some of these potential problems. So I think government has an interesting set of choices to make over to what extent do you go in with a slightly heavier hand versus to what extent do you try and nudge businesses into doing the right sort of thing. And so as Dora was saying, we know that businesses that implement technology in collaboration with their workforces rather than on top of their workforces, if that makes sense, tend to see more productive outcomes, tend to see more harmonious industrial relations, or all of that sort of stuff. It's obviously in government's interest to say, how do you promote that? But obviously you can't mandate it, and trying to get that balance right is going to be really important. But I do think the most important thing to bear in mind in some ways is that if we get this right, this, as with every previous industrial revolution, is something that creates jobs rather than destroys them. And you've got to help specific areas get over some of those challenges where they're particularly affected, as you said, but we shouldn't go into this thinking, how do we protect workers from the computer taking over? We don't need to be sort of 19th century about it. But all of that very often comes back to skills and making sure that businesses and the education sector have the relationship that means there is the agility to provide the skills that businesses will need in the future. And sometimes those are skills that businesses don't even yet know themselves they will want, which is some of the hardest bit to deal with.
Imagine. As we said earlier, because we also thought the future of work may have very personal implications for the audience, we would actually like to see some audience questions without wanting to put you on the spot. And if you can perhaps, I don't know if they will come up here, or do people stand up? Here we go. You can perhaps introduce yourself, and then also which panelist you would like to address the question.
Fantastic panel. Thank you for doing this. My name is Deepak Parmanand. I work as Director of AI Research for JP Morgan. So my questions, one for the MP and one for the panel. The first question is, are we going to see the government going to do 4 days a week, ever? I hope not. Maybe, don't know. Next question is, given the AI and the experiments around universal basic income happening in some parts of the world, what's the take of the government? And does the panelist have an opinion on UBI?
Thank you for your question.
So I think on the first one, for me, this is ultimately about productivity. It's not about whether you are it's not per se about whether you're in the office or not. It's about where is the best place to do the job that you are there to do in a way that works well for you as an employee, but also obviously for the employer. And I think across government, the focus has consistently been on trying to get the very best outcomes on this. Now, there are obviously some views on whether that happens best in the office or at home or in some hybrid version of that, but I think it is about cracking that productivity challenge. What I think is taxing about that to some extent is if where you inevitably have sometimes some conflicts between the employer and the employee on where and how best to do that. And I think almost always that is about winning the argument with the employee rather than having a heavy-handed approach. Now, sometimes the nudges might be slightly more heartfelt, should we say? But I do think this isn't about government mandating. It's never going to be about government mandating this has to be 4 days a week in the office or 3 days a week or whatever. On the 4-day working week, I think, to be honest, it's the same question, just asked through a different lens, right? The 4-day working week comes as a response to people's concerns about the intensification of work. It comes as a response to a whole host of caring responsibilities, all of that. If businesses can get what they need in a 4-day working week and they can afford to pay people for 5 days' work, then good on them. But I don't think it's not. I don't think it's ever going to be for government to say this is what the default looks like.
Yes, who would like to address the universal basic income question? This might be, again, more for policy question, but Stuart, I don't know.
No, I'm probably not qualified to answer specifically on that. But I will, maybe I'm giving a political answer, but if you were to ask a different question about what it's like to work with government, because we're a private sector, we're in joint venture with government, and I just think, step back, I think the ecosystem in the UK for innovation is pretty good, actually. We work with Science Technology Facilities Council to promote innovation. We go to meetings with scientists and interesting organizations, and they sit with us. So they'll bring their life science experts or their space experts, quantum computing, whatever. So we're helping to attract organizations, helping them grow, helping them to move to our clusters. And it's effective. And then stepping back, what is the broader ecosystem like in the UK? I think it's good. You need capital. There's lots of capital, and if you look at the VC stats, I think we're the 4th in the world after, I think, Beijing, San Francisco, and New York. So there's lots of activity, and the stats are really, really encouraging. We see that actually at Harwell and in Oxford, the amount of VC activity in the science, life science, and broader technology sectors. It's really performing well. And then I think the people side is strong as well. Obviously, we've got great universities, hotbed of talent. The government promote people to come to the UK. I'm not a politician, but I'm generally seeing a positive environment there. And then obviously that kind of heady cocktail of money, really intelligent, smart people, strong immigration policy as well. I think it creates a heady cocktail for innovation. So I'm sorry to not answer your question specifically, but I answered another one. Yeah.
But perhaps on the UBI and Dora, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I wonder if you may have a view.
So we don't have currently any projects, or I don't have an organisational position on that currently. What I would highlight is we have a huge focus on what do good jobs look like, and part of that is, of course, questions around pay and security, which of course links to questions around UBI. And for that, we have a good work charter. So we've brought together many experts who looked at different laws, different forms of best practice across the world, and built this charter of principles which detail what does it actually mean to have a good job, and what should we be aspiring to. And so I think that would be where I'd put my emphasis. I'm sorry to slightly sidestep the question.
Everybody's nodding. That's a hard
I mean, look, sorry, just to sort of not sidestep the question, right? I think the question for me, speaking as an individual member of Parliament, not for the government, is what is the problem that UBI is solving, right? And secondly, who is paying it? And presumably the state is paying it with taxpayers' money, so it's not. This isn't free money, right? And secondly, you're presumably seeking to, or advocates of UBI are presumably seeking to solve the problem of people being at risk of simply not having enough money to live a reasonable life. Now, that is ultimately the function of the benefit system. In some ways, a lot of the questions that UBI answers seems to me should be answered by an agile and effective benefit system for people who need it, rather than providing it to people who don't, because the deadweight cost of giving it to people who don't need it just seems to me to be unjustifiable to the taxpayer.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, yes, please.
So I'm going to start off with a contentious statement. I think somebody once wrote that 90% of jobs are bullshit. And anybody who works in large corporations recognizes that many of the jobs really aren't sustainable. There's a huge amount of mental anxiety and mental health problems that are caused by contemporary working. I think there's a statistic that came out the other day that said 8.5 million people in the UK have chosen not to return to the workplace. Now, the question I would love you to try and answer is, rather than patching up work as we know it, and whenever I hear these kinds of conversations, they tend to revolve around innovation, startups, and the audience here understands that. We understand how to start a business, to raise money, to talk to VCs. But the vast majority of the country have no understanding of many of the topics that are talked about at conferences like this. And there seems to me to be a much more fundamental requirement. And to be honest, it's not about left or right-leaning governments any longer. I, for one, feel totally homeless with regard to government. But these are big and brave challenges, and I haven't yet heard anyone come up with answers to those problems. So tell me where to turn and who's got the solutions.
Ooh.
So I'll have a go. So I suppose the answer to why there isn't an answer is because this stuff is big and difficult and hard, and governments around the world are looking at how to try and address some of the issues that you've talked about. But I think ultimately, in some ways, the way I'm looking at the review that I'm trying to do is think of an employer. Let's take the NHS because it's the biggest one in the country, for instance. There are some jobs, some unexpected jobs, that are going to be massively affected by technology relatively quickly. If you're a radiographer, then computers are really good at pattern recognition. That's sort of your job. You are going to be able to use those technologies a lot really quickly. If you're the consultant surgeon, you can probably work from home quite a lot, literally operating in some scenarios. If you go to the other end of the pay scale, if you're the porter or the receptionist, far more porters and receptionists in the health service than there are consultant surgeons or radiographers, your job is not that susceptible to automation. It's going to be a much more similar to what it's been like for a number of decades, and yet people all across the income spectrum, even just to take that one employer, are reporting the same stresses of intensification. You can talk about it through that mental health lens, if you like, as well. And I think a lot of that comes down to other factors. It comes down to feeling like a job is precarious. It comes down to that sense that they are the cliche of being 3 paychecks away from homelessness, which is is more of a cliche than it is a sort of useful lens to look at it. But it is how a lot of people see it. I think those are that, but all of that stuff comes together into a sense of you've got to make sure that people have the skills to move on to jobs that are more secure or where their employment is more transferable. You've got to have a system that addresses some of the skills crisis, the housing issues that mean that people are spending huge chunks of all of their income on one particular thing. You've got to be looking at what it is that gives them that sense of precariousness, and are the workers' rights that they have really doing what they should be doing. Now, the reason I mention a huge range of things in answer to a relatively short question is simply to reinforce that we need an approach that goes across the government rather than look simply at a number of different silos. And that's what makes it so hard. And so in some ways, the question I think we've got to answer is, yes, how can we reimagine stuff? How can we think much more creatively, all of that? That's fine. But really the question we've got to answer is, how do we try and address the problems in a world where we can't reimagine everything? You can't overnight solve the housing crisis. You can't overnight address the fact that you're going to need porters, whether you or they like it or not, for a long time in the health service. So it is massively multifactorial, and addressing that starts with acknowledging that it is massively multifactorial rather than imagining that there is a silver bullet, which I'm not suggesting that you're doing, but I do think understanding the breadth and complexity of this across the whole range of jobs that exist in the economy is where we've got to start.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. I think maybe Brian could offer a perspective, just because you are so much working at changing the type of jobs human might do. So I don't know if you have a view.
Yeah, sure. I think there were probably a lot of questions in that question. And the thing that comes to mind the most, though, is that technology in and of itself is not a solution or a problem, right? Hopefully it's a tool that we can use to solve a problem, but what is the problem that we want it to address? You know, we think about, there was a question about UBI. I'm not going to answer either. I'm not qualified to talk about that as a system. But is that an attempt to change the benefit system, right? Or, you know, what's the problem that it's trying to address? Could that problem be addressed, you know, differently? I think a lot of times the simple answers that feel right maybe miss the complexity of the system, and that we really need to start with the problem we want to solve, have this kind of minimum threshold of don't make it worse. Because when you use technologies like artificial intelligence, it's the speed that really makes it good at what it does. It can make this decision so quickly and deal with the complexity in data and make that decision very quickly. And it can scale to affect everyone. And so you have to approach it from the standpoint of just don't make it worse, and then incrementally make it better. And I think that's how we ramp it up. And it probably ties back to how you opened your question, which was somebody saying that 90% of jobs were bullshit. I think that number's obviously too high, and it's hyperbolic. But if it was 50%, I don't think it's 50% of people and their jobs. It's probably 50% of the jobs they do is unnecessary. And how can we use these technologies to make that more efficient, so they're doing less of the bullshit and more of the stuff that actually makes a difference? Because when you play this out to the next logical conclusion, when you think about it in terms of an industrial revolution, like was said, you know, the implication is, if the UK can't skill up the workers to take advantage of this, the effect will be very similar to what happened to retail, which was completely displaced, you know, to companies that are delivering that, you know, through the internet, but that are not UK companies. And now, if that could affect any enterprise, anywhere people do work in the UK, and that can be partially automated and streamlined in a way that gets disrupted by non-UK companies that aren't participating in the economy, that's existential. And that's what we need to think about, and that's where we need to think about longer-term things like education for, you know, not just, you know, from primary up, not just postdoc, but what about all the people in the middle of business today that will be leading that business in 10 years? How do they get an intuition for what to do with machine learning and how it can transform operations in something that might be a traditional durable goods manufacturer that could actually benefit from it, but doesn't know where to start.
Thank you. We probably have time for 2 more questions. I'm looking for... please.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights. Rashmi Rao, Director of Strateq Limited. Much has been said and written. So, for example, Linda Grattan and Andrew Scott about the 100-year life from London Business School. McKinsey has written and publishes copious reports about the evolving nature of roles. I'm waiting to see the job advert, if such a thing will exist, about the actuary or the pricing specialist for real estate and metaverse. That'll be fun, wouldn't it? And of course, the kind of the pension gap, the gig economy, and the kind of psychological and emotional appeal of work being more purpose-led. So there is kind of the generational aspect. There is the changing nature of roles. There is the need and desire to work longer. So there's multiple attributes beyond kind of the geography and how it impacts UK and kind of the rest of the country, rest of the world. So any thoughts on how these aspects are playing into the future of work? And of course, the real future of work is there is no work, right? We all have fun and we do what we are passionate about, and hopefully the rewards follow. But just curious that given some of these trends where much is being said and written, how that plays into the future of work.
I don't know, Dora, if you feel best placed, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, I think these are all excellent points, and they all contribute to what has been perfectly described by my fellow panelists as such a complex sort of area of discussion and fast evolving area. I think. How do we address this? I think the only way we can address this is by speaking across government, industry, civil society, employers, and coming together to really think about, what future do we want and how do we build it in a way that balances these different interests. So that's partly what we do through our APPG, but also through the different networks that we're involved in. And I think that was the main thing I wanted to talk about, that sort of also you touched a bit about well-being and what is the future of work. I think there's been a lot of research that shows it's unlikely that jobs are going to disappear. It's more likely that jobs are going to change, and as Matt mentioned, some of them significantly. I think then we should be asking ourselves, well, how do we, what do we emphasize within that context? And I would say well-being is one of the things that we should be thinking about more. We hear that being talked about when we talk about flexible work or employee well-being, but also what does it mean for the nature of our work and why we go to work? How do we measure well-being as an output, as a society, or also as an employer? And that's also what we're looking at as part of the Pissarides review. We're looking at how does work impact well-being across the country. We've got a lot of health researchers who are part of that review because we see that as also a very important area that we need to be looking at more going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Stuart.
No, I was just going to add. I think the future where I agree. It's not work might change, but it's not going to go away. But the working environment needs to evolve over time, and I think this COVID experience has made people change the way they operate a lot. So I think certainly in our working environment, we're advocating a flexible working environment. Most people do this kind of 3-day-a-week approach, but then there's a pivot to the physical as well in terms of let's change the environment. Let's promote well-being. We're building these hides to look at birds. We're building these hides around a pond so people can, instead of having a meeting in a boring old meeting room, they can go out and use the hides for relaxation or meetings and things like that. So there's an onus on owners of these campuses and working environments like King's Cross to create these kind of places that are a bit different from what people have had before. In terms of your question about roads, that's obviously going to change dramatically. At Harwell, we're advocating We've actually got an autonomous vehicle driving around campus. There's no driver in it. It drives around. It's a joint venture between the European Space Agency and Telefonica using 5G technology. And this little vehicle drives, it can seat about 8 people, but it cruises around the campus by itself. The organization Darwin is testing that, and hopefully over time you'll see that roll out in a commercial way as well. So I think roads, that whole car parking approach is being addressed by central government and local government all the time. So if you're in the real estate world and you build a building like you see at King's Cross, they have tight regulations on the number of cars you can have in a building, but in the future that's gradually narrowing. So it's evolving. So cars won't disappear forever, but I think it will evolve over time.
Do we have time for one more question? Because I think there's one here.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating panel. So my name's Sarah Hamburg. So I've been working with DAOs for about a year now. So I'm helping build DAOs. I work in DAOs. All my friends do the same things. I'm just curious to hear if any of you sat there in the panel have thought about DAOs in your work, but mostly, like, how is the UK thinking about supporting people like me, people like my network who are wanting to form these DAOs and communities around what they do for their future of their work?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the question. I don't know what they are. So
sorry, I just realized I should have explained that. So a DAO, it's like a decentralized autonomous organization. So it's a digital native community of people who come together using blockchain tools to form communities and create things themselves, rather than having permission from a company or a centralized organization to do those kinds of things.
Fascinating question. Do you know who of you feels?
Yeah. Well, that ecosystem exists in these type of big clusters, virtually and physically as well. So I think certainly we promote that. I use the word multidisciplinary collaboration. So space people talking to life science companies, etc. So we do that virtually within our clusters, but we also do physical meetings. We get people together and have events. Obviously, it's stopped for COVID, but it's now kicking back in. And we really promote it. It's at the heart of innovation, so I think it's good. So,
I would add, I'm quite familiar with the concept. In fact, I'm really excited about it for a number of reasons. But one may not be obvious, but I think it's directly related to why a lot of people are thinking about the idea of decentralization. Is taking power of organizing an organization around a commonly shared goal and being more effective at it, and not requiring any kind of outside control of it. And I think it's really interesting when you think about the idea of superintelligence, kind of the idea of AI becoming self-aware, which we think is pretty fanciful, right? It's kind of superstitious that you're just going to make models bigger and they'll wake up self-aware. But superintelligence does exist in the world today. Just nothing like we're afraid of. It's when you have multiple agents with neural networks or models that are working on behalf of the same objectives, and they deploy limited resources to achieve the objectives and update the objectives when the world changes. Like, these are organizations of people, right? And whether it's parts of some governments or certain corporations, when they can organize that activity, more efficiently than others, they can drastically outperform their peer groups. And we see that, constantly in the market. Certain companies, they're just perfectly coalescing around their objectives and their values in a way that actualizes the members of that group. Why not use it in a way, with a technology like a blockchain and DAO to let this spontaneously occur, and then focus on optimizing that organizational intelligence and how do you make that more streamlined so they can outperform their peer group? Anyway, I think it's super exciting technology.
And I think from a government point of view, if the question that I've been asked to answer is how does government incentivize good work, then one of the things we know about good work, loaded term though it is that one of the things that people say they really like and benefit from is a sense of agency and autonomy and that sort of thing. And the kind of structures that you're describing really promote that. And that is obviously a good thing. It's not for government to it's quite hard for government to do anything that is beyond the sort of nudging stuff in this area, I think. But what what we do have to ask ourselves is, what is it that government's doing that potentially gets in the way of people doing those things that they say they want and they enjoy? And I think that's an open question. People haven't yet come to me with sort of, here is a long list of all the things that I wish government would stop doing. That does get in the way of it, but I do think it has to be something that is constantly on government's mind. If you're going to say we're going to be light touch, we're going to set people free, let 1,000 flowers bloom, all those cliches, then you've got to work out where it is that you're stopping that happening and trying to get out of the way as quickly as possible.
Thank you for the question. I think that's a wrap. Okay. Yes, I'm being heard. Thank you very much for your engaged questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Barbara. If ever you weren't clear that we're living in, to quote Azim Azhar, an exponential age, when you have talks like